Hi guys, so we're back for our next session of reading with Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and today we're going to be reading chapter 16 and chapter 17. Mads is here with me again to hear the next part of our story. Say hey, Mads. All right guys, so we're going to go ahead and pick up with chapter 16, which is called the Oompa Loompas, and I can't wait to read and hear more about these interesting characters. All right, here we go. Chapter 16, the Oompa Loompas. You say there are no people in the world as small as that, said Mr. Wonka, laughing. Then let me tell you something. There are more than 3,000 of them right here in my factory. They must be pygmies, said Charlie. Right, cried Mr. Wonka. Pygmies they are, imported direct from Africa. They belong to a tribe of tiny miniature pygmies known as the Oompa Loompas. I discovered them myself. I brought them over from Africa myself, the whole tribe of them. 3,000 in all. I found them in the very deepest and darkest part of the African jungle, where no white man had ever been before. They were living in tree houses. They had to live in tree houses. Otherwise, being so small, they would have been gobbled up by every animal in the jungle. And when I found them, they were practically starving to death. They were living on green caterpillars, and the caterpillars tasted revolting, and the Oompa Loompas spent every moment of their days climbing through the treetops, looking for other things to mash up with the caterpillars to make them taste better. Red beetles, for instance, and eucalyptus leaves, and the bark of the bong-bong tree, all of them beastly, but not quite so beastly as the caterpillars. Poor little Oompa Loompas. The one food that they longed for more than any other was the cacao bean. But they couldn't get it. And Oompa Loompa was lucky if he found 3 or 4 cacao beans a year. But oh, how they craved them. They used to dream about cacao beans all night and talk about them all day. You had only to mention the word cacao to an Oompa Loompa, and he would start dribbling at the mouth. The cacao bean, Mr. Wonka continued, which grows on the cacao tree, happens to be the thing from which all chocolate is made. You cannot make chocolate without the cacao bean. The cacao bean is chocolate. I myself use billions of cacao beans every week in this factory. And so, my dear children, as soon as I discovered that the Oompa Loompas were crazy for this particular food, I climbed up to their treehouse village and poked my head in through the door of the treehouse belonging to the leader of the tribe. The poor little fellow, looking thin and starved, was sitting there trying to eat a bowl full of mushed up green caterpillars without being sick. Look here, I said, speaking not in English, of course, but in Oompa Loompa. Look here. If you and all your people will come back to my country and live in my factory, you can have all the cacao beans that you want. I've got mountains of them in my storehouses. You can have cacao beans for every meal. You can gorge yourself silly on them. I'll even pay your wages in cacao beans if you wish. You really mean it? Asked the Oompa Loompa leader, leaping up from his chair. Of course I mean it, I said. And you can have chocolate as well. Chocolate tastes even better than cacao beans because it's got milk and sugar added. The little man gave a great whoop of joy, and he threw his bowl of mashed caterpillars right out of the treehouse window. It's a deal, he cried. Come on, let's go. So I shipped them all over here, every man, woman, and child in the Oompa Loompa tribe. It was easy. I smuggled them over in large packing cases with holes in them, and they all got here safely. They are wonderful workers. They all speak English now. They love dancing and music. They're always making up songs. I expect you will hear a good deal of singing today from time to time. I must warn you, though, they are rather mischievous. They like jokes. They still wear the same kind of clothes they wore in the jungle. They insist upon that. The men, as you can see for yourselves across the river, they wear only deer skins. The women wear leaves, and the children, they wear nothing at all. The women use fresh leaves every day. Daddy, shouted Veruca Salt, the girl who got everything she wanted. Daddy, I want an Oompa Loompa. I want you to get me an Oompa Loompa. I want an Oompa Loompa right away. I want to take it home with me. Go on, Daddy, get me an Oompa Loompa. Now, my pet, her father said to her. We mustn't interrupt Mr. Wonka. But I want an Oompa Loompa, screamed Veruca. All right, Veruca, all right. But I can't get it for you this second. Please be patient. I'll see you have one before the day is out. Now, that's very interesting, a little glimpse into Veruca's attitude and her character there, because she's pretty spoiled. She's getting everything that she wants, and she's thrown this little fit. Now her father said, all right, before the day is out, I'll have you a little Oompa Loompa. All right, let's continue reading. Augustus, shouted Mrs. Gloop. Augustus, sweetheart. I don't think you had better do that. Augustus Gloop, as you might have guessed, had quietly sneaked down to the edge of the river, and he was now kneeling on the river bank, scooping hot melted chocolate into his mouth as fast as he could. Now, we're going to stop here for a minute with chapter, and we're going to pick up with chapter 17, which is called Augustus Gloop Goes Up the Pipe. Now, I do like that they give us these little glimpses into the characteristics of the characters that we're reading about. So we see a little bit better about Veruca and how she gets there. She throws fits until she gets everything she wants. And now we have Augustus, who likes his food. He kind of likes to eat. And so we have Augustus who's kind of sneaked over, and he's scooping up mouthfuls of that chocolate into his mouth, which is something he's not supposed to be doing. So let's see what happens to our Augustus Gloop in chapter 17. All right, let's keep reading. Chapter 17, Augustus Gloop Goes Up the Pipe. When Mr. Wonka turned around and saw what Augustus Gloop was doing, he cried out, "Oh no, please, Augustus, please. I beg of you not to do that. My chocolate must be untouched by human hands." "Augustus," called out Mrs. Gloop, "didn't you hear what the man said? Come away from that river at once." "This stuff is terrific," said Augustus, taking not the slightest notice of his mother or Mr. Wonka. "Oh boy, I need a bucket to drink it properly." "Augustus," cried Mr. Wonka, hopping up and down and waggling his stick in the air, "you must come away. You are dirtying my chocolate." "Augustus," cried Mrs. Gloop. "Augustus," cried Mr. Gloop. But Augustus was deaf to everything except the call of his enormous stomach. He was now lying full length on the ground, with his head far out over the river, lapping up the chocolate like a dog. Now look at that last sentence, lapping up the chocolate like a dog. I see a simile there, don't you? They're comparing the way Augustus is drinking up that chocolate the way the dog laps up his water from a bowl. So lapping up the chocolate like a dog. Can you picture that? All right, let's continue reading. "Augustus," shouted Mrs. Gloop, "you'll be giving that nasty cold of yours to about 1 million people all over the country." "Be careful, Augustus," shouted Mr. Gloop. "You're leaning too far out." Mr. Gloop was absolutely right, for suddenly there was a shriek and then a splash, and into the river went Augustus Gloop, and in 1 second he had disappeared under the brown surface. "Save him!" screamed Mrs. Gloop, going white in the face and waving her umbrella about. "He'll drown! He can't swim a yard! Save him! Save him!" "Good heavens, woman," said Mr. Gloop. "I'm not diving in there. I've got my best suit on." Augustus Gloop's face came up again to the surface, painted brown with chocolate. "Help! Help! Help!" he yelled. "Fish me out!" "Don't just stand there," Mrs. Gloop screamed at Mr. Gloop. "Do something." "I am doing something," said Mr. Gloop, who was now taking off his jacket and getting ready to dive into the chocolate. But while he was doing this, the wretched boy was being sucked closer and closer toward the mouth of one of the great pipes that was dangling down into the river. Then all at once, the powerful suction took hold of him completely, and he was pulled under the surface and then into the mouth of the pipe. The crowd on the riverbank waited breathlessly to see where he would come out. "There he goes!" somebody shouted, pointing upwards. And sure enough, because the pipe was made of glass, Augustus Gloop could be clearly seen shooting up inside it, head first like a torpedo. "Help! Murder! Police!" screamed Mrs. Gloop. "Augustus, come back at once. Where are you going?" "It's a wonder to me," said Mr. Gloop, "how that pipe is big enough for him to go through it." "It isn't big enough," said Charlie Bucket. "Oh dear, look! He's slowing down." "So he is," said Grandpa Joe. "He's going to stick," said Charlie. "I think he is," said Grandpa Joe. "By golly, he has stuck," said Charlie. "It's his stomach that's done it," said Mr. Gloop. "He's blocked the whole pipe," said Grandpa Joe. "Smash the pipe!" yelled Mrs. Gloop, still waving her umbrella. "Augustus, come out of there at once." The watchers below could see the chocolate swishing around the boy in the pipe, and they could see it building up behind him in a solid mass, pushing against the blockage. The pressure was terrific. Something had to give. Something did give. And that something was Augustus. Whew! Up he shot again like a bullet in the barrel of a gun. "He's disappeared," yelled Mrs. Gloop. "Where does that pipe go to? Quick, call the fire brigade." "Keep calm," cried Mr. Wonka. "Keep calm, my dear lady, keep calm. There is no danger whatsoever. Augustus has gone on a little journey, that's all. A most interesting little journey, but he'll come out of it just fine. You wait and see." "How can he possibly come out just fine?" snapped Mrs. Gloop. "He'll be made into marshmallows in 5 seconds. "Impossible!" cried Mr. Wonka. "Unthinkable! Inconceivable! Absurd! He could never be made into marshmallows." "And why not, may I ask?" shouted Mrs. Gloop. "Because that pipe doesn't go to the marshmallow room," Mr. Wonka answered. "It doesn't go anywhere near it. That pipe, the one Augustus went up, happens to lead directly to the room where I make a most delicious kind of strawberry-flavored chocolate-coated fudge." "Then he'll be made into strawberry-flavored chocolate-coated fudge," screamed Mrs. Gloop. "My poor Augustus! They'll be selling him by the pound all over the country tomorrow morning." "Quite right," said Mr. Gloop. "I know I'm right," said Mrs. Gloop. "It's beyond a joke," said Mr. Gloop. "Mr. Wonka doesn't seem to think so," cried Mrs. Gloop. "Just look at him. He's laughing his head off. How dare you laugh like that when my boy's just gone up the pipe? You monster!" she shrieked, pointing her umbrella at Mr. Wonka as though she were going to run him through. "You think it's a joke, do you? You think that sucking my boy up into your fudge room like that is just one great big colossal joke?" "He'll be perfectly safe," said Mr. Wonka, giggling slightly. "He'll be chocolate fudge!" shrieked Mrs. Gloop. "Never!" cried Mr. Wonka. "Of course he will!" shrieked Mrs. Gloop. "I wouldn't allow it!" cried Mr. Wonka. "And why not?" shrieked Mrs. Gloop. "Because the taste would be terrible," said Mr. Wonka. "Just imagine it! Augustus flavored chocolate-coated Gloop? No one would buy it." "They most certainly would!" cried Mr. Gloop indignantly. "I don't want to think about it!" shrieked Mrs. Gloop. "Nor do I," said Mr. Wonka. "And I do promise you, madame, that your darling boy is perfectly safe." "If he's perfectly safe, then where is he?" snapped Mrs. Gloop. "Lead me to him this instant." Mr. Wonka turned around and clicked his fingers sharply. Click, 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 3 times. Immediately an Oompa Loompa appeared, as if from nowhere, and stood beside him. The Oompa Loompa bowed and smiled, showing his beautiful white teeth. His skin was almost pure black, and the top of his fuzzy head came just above the height of Mr. Wonka's knee. He wore the usual deerskin slung over his shoulder. "Now, listen to me," said Mr. Wonka, looking down at the tiny man. "I want you to take Mr. and Mrs. Gloop up to the fudge room and help them find their son, Augustus. He's just gone up the pipe." The Oompa Loompa took one look at Mrs. Gloop and exploded into peals of laughter. "Oh, do be quiet," said Mr. Wonka. "Control yourself. Pull yourself together. Mrs. Gloop doesn't think it's at all funny." "You can say that again," said Mrs. Gloop. "Go straight to the fudge room," Mr. Wonka said to the Oompa Loompa. "And when you get there, take a long stick and start poking around inside the big chocolate mixing barrel. I'm almost certain that you'll find him in there. But you'd better look sharp. You'll have to hurry. If you leave him in the chocolate mixing barrel too long, he's liable to get poured out into the fudge boiler. And that really would be a disaster, wouldn't it? My fudge would become quite uneatable." Mrs. Gloop let out a shriek of fury. "I'm joking," said Mr. Wonka, giggling madly behind his beard. "I didn't mean it. Forgive me. I'm so sorry. Goodbye, Mrs. Gloop and Mr. Gloop. Goodbye. Goodbye. I'll see you later." As Mr. and Mrs. Gloop and their tiny escort hurried away, the 5 Oompa Loompas on the far side of the river suddenly began hopping and dancing about and beating wildly upon a number of very small drums. "Augustus Gloop," they chanted. "Augustus Gloop. Augustus Gloop. Augustus Gloop." "Grandpa," cried Charlie. "Listen to them, Grandpa. What are they doing?" "Shh," whispered Grandpa Joe. "I think they're going to sing us a song." "Augustus Gloop," chanted the Oompa Loompas. "Augustus Gloop. Augustus Gloop. The great big greedy nincompoop. How long could we allow this beast to gorge and guzzle, feed and feast on everything that he wanted to? Great Scott, it simply wouldn't do. However long this pig might live, we're positive he'd never give even the smallest bit of fun or happiness to anyone. So what do we do in cases such as this? We use the gentle touch, and carefully we take the brat and turn him into something that will give great pleasure to us all. A doll, for instance, or a ball, or marbles, or a rocking horse. But this revolting boy, of course, was so unutterably vile, so greedy, so foul and infantile. He left a most disgusting taste inside our mouths, and so in haste we chose a thing that, come what may, would take the nasty taste away. Come on, we cried, the time is ripe to send him shooting up the pipe. He has to go, it has to be, and very soon he's going to see. Inside the room to which he's gone, some funny things are going on. But don't, dear children, be alarmed. Augustus Gloop will not be harmed. Although, of course, we must admit, he will be altered quite a bit. He'll be quite changed from what he's been when he goes through the fudge machine. Slowly the wheels go round and round, the cogs begin to grind and pound. 100 knives go slice, slice, slice. We add some sugar, cream, and spice. We boil him for a minute more until we're absolutely sure that all the greed and all the gall is boiled away for once and all. Then out he comes, and now, by grace, a miracle has taken place. This boy, who only just before was loathed by men from shore to shore, this greedy brute, this louse's ear, is loved by people everywhere. For who could hate or bear a grudge against a luscious bit of fudge? "I told you they love singing," cried Mr. Wonka. "Aren't they delightful? Aren't they charming? But you mustn't believe a word they said. It's all nonsense, every bit of it. Are the Oompa Loompas really joking, Grandpa asked Charlie. Of course they're joking, answered Grandpa Joe. They must be joking. At least, I hope they're joking. Don't you? All right, so we're going to stop here at the end of chapter 17, and it's been very interesting to see what happened to our Augustus Gloop, who decided to be greedy and was lapping up that chocolate, and all of a sudden, up the pipe he goes. So when we come back together, we're going to pick up with chapter 18, which is called Down the Chocolate River, and I can't wait to see what happens to the rest of our characters. So until we read together again, you guys stay safe. We love you. We miss you. Mrs. Wingo.